I've been pushing into higher keys this season, and I've been having a ton of fun solving all the puzzles that need to be solved in order to time them and rack up my nerd points. It's no longer just how can I do as much damage as possible so people think I'm cool, it's what tools do I need to use to stay alive? What buttons can I press to make my group's life easier, and when should I press them? Mythic Plus can be challenging, undoubtedly. While a portion of that challenge comes from physical hindrances, your fingers don't do what you want them to do, your eyes get tired, maybe you have the attention span of a goldfish. P.S. Not watching Harry Potter on your second monitor might help with that a little bit.
It's Leviosa, not Leviosa.
The biggest thing holding you back from playing like the god you aspire to be is knowledge.
Knowledge.
We get so caught up in panic mode by constantly being on the edge of our seats, mashing buttons and greeting damage to stay at the top of the details meters so no one calls us out, that we often forget to use some of the most powerful tools in our kit that can make the run miles easier for everyone and result in just way more value than a few extra globals. Now, I'm not saying your damage isn't important, because it definitely is, especially if you're playing with an Augievoker who's relying on you by giving you their buffs and expecting you to pick up the slack from them hitting like a soggy churro. But as the saying goes, a dead DPS is a worthless DPS. So learn to live first, then start optimizing your button mashing. But all that being said, I'm going to give you some tips for both damage and survivability that I've had to learn as I've gone from casually playing 21s, 22s last season to smashing 26, 27s, and even 28s. So let's start with a damage tip. Use damage potions. This one may seem obvious, but I want you to check details after keys you do and look for potion usage throughout your group. You'd be amazed at how many people only use a damage pot for the very first pull with Lust. And that's it. These potions are on a 5-minute cooldown, so technically on paper you should get 6 uses in a 30-minute dungeon. But you'll be sacrificing 1 or 2 of those to make sure you're lining them up with your other major cooldowns for maximum effectiveness, or making sure you're able to use an Invis pot, which shares the same cooldown lockout. One useful trick is that you can use a potion right before the keystone starts, and then once the loading screen passes, the cooldown on your potion will magically be available again. Now, by the time the countdown ends, you'll have lost about 10 seconds off that buff, but depending on the dungeon and how quickly you're going to get to that first pack of trash, you might still have enough of that buff left to cover your opener where you're using all your other big CDs, trinkets, and Lust anyways. Some dungeons take too long between the bear you're dropping and then running and getting to the first pack, that the majority of the pre-pot is wasted and it doesn't cover your opener. In that case, just don't even bother pre-potting. Also, be sure to not make this mistake like I was for the longest time. Let me describe it to you. I would habitually always pre-pot in a key, wait for the barrier to drop, and start running towards the first pack. But then right before engaging in combat, regardless of how much the pre-pot I still had left, I would still use another potion, and the duration doesn't stack. It just refreshes the buff back up to 30 seconds, meaning that pre-pot was nothing more than me burning gold before every key. Oops. Moral of the story here is to think about where you're using your damage pots and don't forget to use them all together. Make sure you're using them. The difference between someone who uses pots and someone who doesn't is much larger than you think. Help your healer. Press your defensives. For this one, I'll be using Havoc Demon Hunter as an example, but the same principles apply to every class in spec. Believe it or not, you do have buttons that don't do damage that you are expected to press. The more you help your healer, the less they have to heal, and the more freedom they have to help with damage, which ultimately means an easier time to key. Or at the very least, you pressing your defensives means you're living more, so you can do more damage. However, you need to justify it to yourself. Just make sure you're pressing them. So let's take a look at Havoc. We have Blur, a 50% chance to dodge and a 20% DR for 10 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. Darkness, which is a 30% chance to avoid all damage from attacks for whoever is standing inside of it for 8 seconds, which is on a 5-minute cooldown or 3 minutes if talented. The often slept on Deflecting Dance, which gives you an absorb shield for up to 15% of your maximum health during the animation of Blade Dance. Netherwalk, which makes you take 0 damage for 6 seconds on a 3-minute cooldown. And of course things like health pots and lockstones, which everyone should be using if you have them. There's lots of tools at your disposal. Defensives are unique in the sense that they're used as an answer to something. They're meant to counter things that reduce your health. I know this sounds silly, but stay with me for a second. With that in mind, you want to be using your defensives with purpose. Even though something like Blur is on a 1-minute cooldown, you don't want to just use it haphazardly every minute as soon as it's up so you can say you used it as many times as possible. The great thing about Blur is that because its cooldown is so low, you generally have it available whenever you actually need it. What separates the boys from the men when it comes to defensives is understanding how each defensive tool is different from each other and the different use cases they have. Netherwalk and Blur, although both being personal and having the potential to make you take 0 damage, are used for very, very different reasons. Netherwalk will straight up prevent you from death. If you see death staring you in the eyes, there's a mechanic that is almost certainly going to kill you, you Netherwalk. Blur, on the other hand, gives you a 20% damage reduction, and that's applied to every bit of damage you take inside of this buff. So let's say you're fighting the dragon boss in Darkheart Thicket. When it uses its pushback wind ability, there's a lot of ticking damage happening. Each of those ticks will be reduced by Blur. Now you might be asking, okay, what about the 50% dodge chance? That should help too, right? Well, no, not in this case, because the only things that can be dodged are close range melee attacks. Ranged or spell attacks cannot be dodged. So this is an example where knowledge can give you that edge over the other guy. Sure, using Netherwalk against the wind makes you take 0 damage from it and you get some movement speed to counteract the pushback, but it also locks you out from pressing any other buttons for that 6 seconds. You take 0 damage, but you also deal 0 damage. Blur will make that mechanic more tolerable and afford you the freedom to keep on with your rotation so you can actually kill the boss. Now let's talk about Darkness, because I see this ability misused way too often. It puts an area on the ground that your group can stand in, and while they're standing in it, every instance of damage, so every tick of a dot, every melee swing, every boss mechanic has a 30% chance in dungeons, 15 in raid, to do 0 damage. So let's say we're fighting Tyr in Murozond's Rise. Dividing Strike is a mechanic that your whole group has to soak together, and the damage is divided across players. So you will always take whatever your portion of the damage split is. It doesn't matter if someone soaks and somehow doesn't take any damage because they immuned it. That doesn't mean you take less. You will always still take your share, and then it's reduced or mitigated based on whatever you have happening on your character at the time in terms of buffs or damage mitigation or DRs. Now, using Darkness on that mechanic is a little odd because it's one large hit against each group member, meaning you have one chance, one roll of the dice per group member on whether they take damage or not. You have a 30% chance to take no damage, but also you have a 70% chance to take full damage. Say you used it and you happen to high roll and Darkness saves everyone and your entire group takes 0 damage from that mechanic. It's likely that other defensives were also used in that moment as a backup, but because Darkness did all the work there, those other defensives that were used were completely wasted. This is the problem with using it on one-hit mechanics. It's just not worth the gamble in more ways than one. It's much better used on the Dragon Pull directly after Tyr, where the ability Infinite Fury is ticking on your entire group 5 times for smaller portions of damage that each aren't life or death. You might completely avoid 2 of those ticks with Darkness, but the other 3 that Darkness didn't save you from will also be mitigated by the other party-wide defensives or just by the fact that damage was less spiky and it allowed your healer more time to react. Learn the dungeons and learn the bosses. You might already think you're a master of these dungeons and you know everything there is to know, but I bet you if you open up MDT, browse through the abilities on bosses and trash, you'll make some shocking discoveries. Did you know that Sister Briar's interruptible cast in Waycrest is physical damage and is naturally reduced by the player's armor? Meaning kicking Malady or Selena should be a higher priority. This doesn't mean you don't need to interrupt Briar, but when I'm running into that fight as a DPS player and we're starting damage on Selena, I'm setting Malady as my focus for focus interrupts, as missing those interrupts would be more detrimental than Briar's. Or did you know Aronach's Stonespeaker's totem in Throne of the Tides increases the boss's attack speed by 100% and does ramping nature damage for each successful attack as long as the totem's up? That sounds like a pretty great place to use Darkness, by the way. So there's actually this brand new website in development called deplete.fyi. It's essentially crowdsourced notes on an MDT map. You can click around on mobs and bosses in dungeons, and see tips and tricks that other people have left for the community to see. The site is a bit bare bones at the moment, but definitely bookmark this and check it from time to time. I think this is a great idea, and I could see it being very, very useful, especially next season when we have a whole new set of dungeons to work with. I'll put a link down in the description. Learning these things, even if it's just 1 or 2 at a time, will eventually add up and fill your knowledge meter, which in turn increases your chance of successful keys. Once you know what abilities do, then you need to pay attention to when they happen. Most people will install something like Bigwigs or DBM, maybe they get a dungeon week or a pack, but then they never actually look at them for the info. I've seen some people with 3 different sections of timers stacked on top of each other in the top right corner of their screen, all displaying the same information. Ain't no way they're looking at that. Knowing when mechanics are about to happen is key to knowing when to use your defensives or when to change your positioning, stuff like that. If you're not actively watching your timers, you're setting yourself up for failure. If you want even more tips for timing keys and becoming a better player, check out one of these other videos. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.